So welcome to At the Table. At the Table is a series of roundtable discussions where Asian American Christians, pastors, and leaders are able to draw from their experiences, education, and expertise to discuss questions and issues that impact the Asian American Christian community and the church. At the Table is a production of AACC, or the Asian American Christian Collaborative. We're so glad that you could join us for this panel on flourishing in relationships. Before we begin, we'd love for everyone to introduce themselves. My name is Kevin Yee, and I am the Young Adults and the College Ministry Pastor at Church Everyday, Korean Immigrant Church outside of Los Angeles. We'll start over here.
My name is Ray Chang, and I serve as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative.
I'm Vivian Long. I'm the executive director of the Long Family Foundation.
My name is Jill Rogers, and I don't feel like I have a good title. I'm a Christ follower who loves to build community. Can be a little bit inappropriate and jovial sometimes. I love to keep it authentic, gather women around the Word, and so in thinking just doing some of those things, I've been MC, speaker, host, community builder, loving the life like that.
That's great. So I'm going to start with our first question, which is all about flourishing. So what does flourishing mean to you?
I think that the scripture that came to my mind was from Ephesians 2:10. And we are God's workmanship created in Christ Jesus for good works that He prepared in advance for us to do. So I think when we make peace with the Lord, our Creator, and get some of our baggage and forgiveness and get that relationship in place, this form that He's given us, everything included our story, our ethnicity, our culture, our gifts, skills, passions, bents. When those get in line with the one who created us, then we are like just set free to use them wherever we go. So it's when form and function meets the satisfaction in our life with Christ, I think, is when we have this freedom to flourish.
Yeah, I had a very similar thought, which was just being at peace with what God has given us and the circumstances that He's given us, the resources that He's given us, the talents, the people in our lives that He's given us. When we can truly be at peace and I think grateful for it, regardless of difficult circumstances, I think that's a sign of flourishing.
Yeah, I'd add to that by saying I think flourishing is fullness in so many ways. It's a sense where regardless of what you have, you know you don't lack. There is a sense in which I think, you know, our wholeness is experienced not just cerebrally, but in an embodied and emotionally, mentally, spiritual manner, and so yeah, I'd say that's probably what flourishing is.
That's really good. In light of what our panel discussion is, I think about flourishing, like one of the ways that you know you're flourishing is when you're able to be fully present with others. Like I think when you're not doing well, it's really difficult to show up for others. So, you know, moving on to talking about relationships. So let's begin by asking you, so in what ways do you think Asian Americans generally relate to each other that are distinct from other groups? So what is it about our Asian Americanness that makes our relationships distinct? And then do you think that there are things about our Christian faith that change the way that we relate to others?
I think that there is no one way that Asian Americans relate to other people, whether it's other Asian Americans or, you know, just the broader public. So there's no script that people are required to follow as Asian Americans. With that said, there do seem to be trends and patterns and ways that our communities have taught us to interact with ourselves, with one another, and then with the broader kind of populations. I do think that part of the ways in which Asian Americans kind of interact with others is first to take a listening approach and to survey the landscape to make sure that they get the context of what they're walking into or what they're speaking into, to read the room. You know, in Korean we have something called nunchi, you know, which is this kind of perception of the atmosphere, kind of this awareness, the social awareness, and it's not necessarily vocalized or verbalized because we often come from high context. I mean, almost all Asian ethnicities and cultures are high context, and so you don't need a lot of words to communicate. Right. You just kind of know. With that said, I do think that there is a variety of ways in which people interact as a result of how they've been socialized, their upbringings, their own experiences, what communities that they're comfortable in, how much they feel like they can press into their heritage or their culture of their heritage, or they distance themselves or feel abandoned by or press against it.
Yeah, I think that it's also a very distinct category of being Asian American too, which is something that I think has generationally changed. So I think, my parents would identify first and foremost as Chinese American, whereas I think I identify much more with a broader Asian American culture. And then my kids, who are half South Asian, half Indian, and half Chinese, they'll probably, I have no idea how they'll identify, but probably Asian American in some way as well. And so I think, there's a generational layer on top of it of like our feeling tied to our heritage, but also the separation from our country of origin. Maybe we have really no tie to it at all. And, but knowing that our Asian identity is so integral to who we are and who we've become.
So in other words, what are the things about our cultures, as Ray was talking about earlier, that are super powerful, that are the things that draw us towards one another? What is it about our cultures that allows us to have the kinds of deep relationships that we have?
Well, we like to eat.
Amen.
Yeah, community around the table. That's biblical.
That's very biblical.
Breaking bread together. Yeah, we're missing food at the table.
Yeah.
Our conversation would be so much better.
We needed at least a few pairs of chopsticks.
Yeah.
I think this word responsibility always comes up. I think that there's this weight of responsibility that I think almost all Asian Americans feel. And maybe that responsibility is to something different. Like I think some feel it toward family. I think most feel it toward family, but family, I think if you are a Christian, you feel it toward God, or maybe your church is like, or your church community. But I think that like there's this strong feeling of responsibility, and maybe like in its least healthy form, you could call it like the honor shame mentality. But I think that is something that, across the board, I really see Asian Americans kind of like your whole mindset is formed around that. And I'm always curious, like how much of that is present as well in our countries of origin and expressed in the same way, and how much of it is here and how much of it has been adapted to an American context. And, the awareness that because we're not in a homogenous society, that there are certain ways in which we have to behave to survive or thrive or achieve. I think that responsibility is something that everyone feels. But when you look at it with, I think, other communities of color, it's not, I think like we have the privilege, I think, of feeling responsibility, but not this feeling of like constant threat. And certainly there are threats, and I think like 2020 was a season where it was very scary for a lot of Asian Americans, especially vulnerable Asian Americans. And there certainly is, there are a lot of things that are not great for Asian Americans at times here, but I think, I think that other communities of color, like we also have to be aware of their lived experiences in this country as well. And, how we've been
That's really good.
part of that.
I love the word responsibility, but I've always, in my head, always have said it as obligation, that there's this shared obligation.
the other side of the coin.
Yeah, it's the other side of the coin. But yeah, I love that as a way to think about the idea that who are we responsible for. And this comes with even the Korean form of nunchi. Like when you walk into a space, you're immediately thinking about those. Like those social calculations are immediately happening.
You're thinking about who am I responsible for in this room?
I think just like, what are the responsibilities I have towards these people?
Or like,
I
what's my
think
position in
that too, yeah.
Yeah.
But then but I think the beautiful part of that, the beauty of that is you see that in a situation, in emergency situations. For example, like just this past week, we found out there was a plane crash in Tokyo, and all the passengers on this airplane got off and survived, even though the entire plane burst into flames. And a huge part of that had to do with the way that the Japanese people understand their obligation to each other. Like nobody was grabbing their bags, trying to block the doorway, tackle somebody to get out. And I remember the social media response was basically everyone was like, oh, if this happened in America, everybody on that plane would have died, because everyone would have been trying to individually make their way out of there. And I think that's a part of our shared Asian Americanness, I would say, that I think is so structured. It's what makes us resilient as communities. And I think that's something that like we have to continue to talk about this as a value that the American church needs to understand and see. Like we're the example of this. We're an example of these kinds of communities. And I think that's like a confidence that we should have when we walk into certain spaces.
The confidence of I'm loyal to you. I am loyal to the success of this body.
Yeah. And I think that that's something that we should be celebrating and parroting from the top of the mountains in terms of how our culture shapes us.
I think that is it's a really important disposition. Like, I mean, on the one hand, we have individualism. On the other hand, we have more collectivism or communal kind of dispositions. And I think one thing I wonder and I wrestle with a lot of times is how much kind of the individualism of America, while it does promote like a value of the individual, which I think has been a very significant contribution in history. Because I mean, like, in some ways, if you were like the weak link somewhere in any community, if you weren't being taken care of, you just didn't exist. But there is a sense of like, if every person is important, then we have to care for every single individual. We have to care for them. So that's like the positive side. The negative side is it makes everyone basically fight for themselves and think for themselves and basically live for themselves in a way where they're asking more a question about who they're responsible to instead of who they're responsible for. And I do think that going to your responsibility conversation or comments, Asian Americans naturally do have what you're talking about, a responsibility. We have a sense that we are responsible for more than just ourselves. I also think that being an Asian American, especially with a communal disposition, allows us to see those that, well, I would say if we're Asian American and we're Christian, it will allow us to see the parts of the community that are hurting the most. Because we're more communally oriented and we want to move with the community. And we know that the community cannot move unless the wounded person can move with us. And I don't necessarily see that in a lot of other communities and cultures. And I think it's a lot harder, especially when resources are involved. And I kind of observe in white evangelical or white Christian context how easily disposed people are, whereas it's not so much the case in other minoritized communities. I want to piggyback on that and just say how beautiful it is that God would allow us to bear that image of himself, because that is a reflection of who God is. Because when in Scripture he says, when one part is suffering, we all suffer. And we bear that. We bear that in our group think. And maybe it doesn't make us advance and become entrepreneurs and go conquer the world, but God gave us that image of himself, that we would have eyes to see. And we walk into the room and you see the one who's lonely on the side, you gravitate towards them because we are image bearers of God. And that is what I believe what Jesus would do when he would walk into a room. How cool is that?
I think that's from God's design and how He created us.
Now, as much as we want to celebrate these things, we need to be honest.
About our baggage.
that
I thought that was going to be the other half of this
we have
question.
to talk about. We have to be honest about this. So, what would you say are some of the inhibitors of our, Asian American communities towards having the deep connections and friendships and relationships?
There's so many. I think being Japanese American, I remember speaking with a Chinese American friend. I said, so did you ever have pressure to not be Chinese or to ever have to suppress that? And she said, no, but I did. My family did after the war.
Right.
We had to prove ourselves good Americans. And so, that launched my mom's family into going to church because all good Americans go to church. But there was this pressure to not be a Japanese American because we started the war. But I think a damaging thing that I bring as an Asian American is this really powerful force of shame and just constantly trying to flee from it or protect somebody else from it. And so it keeps me from not speaking truth and exhortation because I might bring shame to somebody who's above me. And so we quietly keep all those things to our side, and then pretty soon there's just huge division and brokenness, and we're not growing because we're not giving each other loving feedback. And the word says, faithful are the wounds of a friend. And so there's a devotion and a friendship that needs to happen from having community and conversation, but then there's that faithfulness we bring to each other when we're willing to say, man, that was really hurtful when you told that boy he couldn't come just because he's Japanese American. Like, for you to say that would be a faithful, loving thing for my son, to have somebody step up and speak up for him, because he couldn't do it. He was the young person in that relationship. But we do it to save face. We do it to preserve our cultures or something. I don't know, because I wasn't there.
No, that's really good, guys. I think there is an element in which there, even when we talk about shame, there is a shackling type of shame that kind of folds us into ourselves, and then there's a liberating shame, right? Paul used shame, and this is like one of Telly Lau who's a New Testament scholar, actually did a whole kind of like study on the idea of shame and the concept of shame in the scriptures, and he basically said that Paul utilized shaming others to basically call them out in their shame, on their sin. And so I think for us, it's to exactly what you just said, is when truth is compromised or when truth can't be brought forward, that's when shame is crippling or shame is destructive. But a shame that allows the truth to kind of emerge, or a shame that the truth can be spoken into and then through, is a liberating shame. Right. And I think our cultures do have a tendency to take in a more crippling type of, debilitating type of shame, where we suffocate the truth and then we go into hiding, and we essentially limit the truth from being able to set us free. I also think, that was a really powerful story about your family and like what it means to be a good American. Because like for me as a Korean American, my parents, they came in. Their immigration story was I'm second generation, so they came in the 70s, and for me, the forces for them was, don't be perceived as a foreigner. To be a good American means that you don't speak Korean. So don't take, and then it's that lunchbox moment where you never take Korean food to school. And I'm like, all I want to do is eat the cucumber kimchi. That's my favorite thing. And they were like, it smells. I'm like,
was it your mom and dad who were saying don't take it?
My mom would not let me take it. And we still talk about it to this day. And I said, why did you do that? And she's like, well, because it smells. I was like, have you smelled some of the other stuff? It's not just our stuff. All food smells. You know?
Bologna has
Yes, it smells like rotten vinegar, and so we talk about that, and so I do think that there is this racialization that for our communities has been imposed on us, but we haven't interrogated enough, or we haven't processed through it enough. So we don't understand the impact of being raced as Asian Americans, or being targeted as Japanese Americans, or Chinese Americans, being excluded as Chinese Americans, and what the impact of that has been on our own kind of collective psyche and our communities, to the point where we just kind of assume that this is the way it is. And sometimes if we have more means and we are in smaller communities or within our particular communities, we can rise above it. But generally, we just have to accept the status quo. And I think that limits our civic engagement. I think that limits our public witness as Christians. I mean, the number of times I've heard, like, especially Black and Latino Christians say, why do Asian American Christians think that they're white? They think there's no difference.
That's what's on my dad's marriage certificate.
That he's white?
There were only two categories.
Yes.
There was white or black. And
yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Dad's white.
Yeah. But even now, beyond like what's on the census or the certificates,
Right.
It's not just on a document where the categories were flawed and limited to begin with. The imagination is shaped where, like someone I know, a close friend of mine, basically said he grew up thinking he was white because he knew he wasn't Black, and he's Asian American. Yeah. But he also never felt like he was fully accepted by the white community. And so he didn't know where else to go. And then it was only at church. But then at church, because he was at an immigrant church and he didn't speak enough, Korean, he was never that enough. And so it's this complicated everywhere but nowhere. And at the same time, we often only navigate things through our own experiences and then don't understand like the broader cultural narratives, the broader kind of the streams that we're kind of flowing in, or the broader kind of air that we're breathing, that it prevents us from actually cultivating change at a broader level.
Yeah, I think one thing you said is like accepting the status quo, and I don't even think it's partially accepting the status quo, but it's also like fully immersing yourself in it and trying to achieve as much as possible in the status quo, which I think is very different than how potentially, well, certainly how the status quo sees it, but like how even other communities of color see the status quo. And I think we've been, some might say, privileged enough that we have that option even, right?
Until a pandemic.
Until a pandemic or something, until something, right? You could say the same thing about World War II. But then I think going back to relationships, the other thing I think that is difficult for us as Asian Americans is vulnerability. Yeah. And it goes back to that honor shame, right? Like I think that shame is powerful for the reasons you named, both in positive and negative context, but an element of shame is that you're vulnerable, right? Like if you go back to the Garden of Eden, like that was the first sign that they had messed up. Like they were naked and they were vulnerable and they were like, oh shoot, like this isn't how I was an hour ago. And I think for Asian Americans, like because shame is such a powerful element of something to fear, as opposed to something that we see as like a teachable moment perhaps, or like something that you grow from, that vulnerability I think really does inhibit sometimes our relationships with each other. Even in our most intimate relationships, there's this feeling of, well, if I am too much am I too much of who I am? Perhaps like there will be some sort of fallout. I will have exposed something about myself that deserves shame. And so I think that's really, prevalent and something that like creates a level of anxiety in a lot of Asian Americans.
A huge brokenness that we bring into our shame culture, kind of trumping who we are in Christ. And I've been in other communities, my other maybe non-ethnic communities, and they just like, "Oh, I struggle with bipolar, or I'm struggling with these suicidal thoughts, and there's no shame in saying it, and it is so refreshing. And then there's healing involved, there's love that is involved, there's commitment to each other, and then we begin to gather around them because they're just so open with how they're struggling. And it's not as easy to encounter in my Asian American communities, because it's shameful to say I was watching something I shouldn't have watched, but when we say it, there's freedom in confession. So it's harder to find a place where the gospel can fully wash over our sin because we don't say it. And so I think also we begin to live out this kind of fake Christian, I have it all together atmosphere, and it's easy for me not to do that because I have it so little. I'm not all together. So, but I want to stay that way because I want women to see me struggle, because this is where we live, and this is what Christ is redeeming inside of me. When I lose my temper with my kids and share that openly with them, they're just like, "Oh, I'm so glad you said that. Yeah, I just did that last night. And then but it's almost a secret."
That vulnerability opens up hearts, is because in some ways it's prophetic. Because what happens is the very thing that we want to keep, when we're exposing that, it brings that up. I mean, that's literally what the prophets are doing even in Israel, right? Like the very thing that the Israelites were doing in secret, the prophets, their job was to expose those things, and that's how the community finds healing.
Who wants to go be the prophet, though? I mean, Japanese, we don't want to be the nail that sticks up. No, that's the one that's going to get hit.
That's the one that's going to get hammered,
But,
But I think that's why it's important that we, talk about these things and share our stories and be as vulnerable as we have been and as you've been, and sharing your what's going on with your family, and just, I think it's such a, it's a powerful tool for Christian ministry leaders to recognize, but it can't be just a tool. It has to be internalized. And that's where we have to, share our stories. We have to find, again, the ability to flourish within our own shame. And how does that work? And how do we do that? And so we have a lot of work to do.
I mean, to your comment, I do wonder if that's what a part of the reason the church is in the state that it's in fractured and somewhat disarray, is the U.S. especially, is because when you look at the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and the teachers, we are significantly lacking prophetic voices within the church, right? And we don't make room because they make us uncomfortable or they challenge us too much. And we've so long been formed without the prophets that we think that our Christianity has nothing to be critiqued or condemned or even transformed. And so I think we have created a type of Christian environment, culture, ecosystem where essentially the voices that we most need are the voices that either are most absent or the most isolated or alienated from our communities.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us at the table. Thank you to our panelists. This conversation was so rich, and there's, again, so many things that we could talk about. But I hope that it was a blessing to everyone who was listening. If you found this helpful, we encourage you to share it with others, and make sure that you sign up for the AACC newsletter at the website, AsianAmericanChristianCollaborative.com or AAChristCollab.com. You can also follow AACC on social networks at AA Christ Collab. AACC is volunteer driven and donor supported. So if you'd like to support the ministry, we encourage you to give online. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time at the table.